Today's target will be solving quadratics by factoring. By the end of today's lesson, you will be able to identify the zeros, roots, and solutions to a quadratic equation by factoring that equation. And you'll be able to write a quadratic equation when giving the zeros or roots for the quadratic. If you do not remember how to factor or you're not comfortable with factoring, go back and watch the factoring videos from Unit 3. Do not go any further in this video without being comfortable with factoring. I will post links to those videos in the description. I'm not going to spend a lot of time covering how we factor in this video. I'm going to assume that you know how to do so. So once again, if you're not comfortable with it or you need a refresher, go back and watch those videos from Unit 3. So we're solving by factoring. Remember from the previous solving video that in order to solve a quadratic, it must be in standard form. Here we're going to find zeros of the quadratic equation, and we're going to do it by factoring. So what we want to do is we're going to take this quadratic and we're going to factor it just like we did in previous units. So we do the first times the last. We look for two pairs of numbers that multiply to that number and also add to give us our middle term. We draw our boxes, x squared, negative 7x, 2x, and negative 14, x and x, 2 and negative 7. So this, in factored form, is x minus 7, x plus 2. Now we're looking for zeros, so we're looking for where does this quadratic equation equal to 0. Now the reason that factoring is important is we can use what's called the zero product property. The zero product property says that anything times 0 is equal to 0. So what that means for us is we have two different binomial factors. If either one of them equals to 0, then the entire thing equals to 0. So what we're going to do is we're going to take each one and we're going to set it equal to 0. So our first one, we're going to add 7 to both sides. That cancels out. We get x equals 7. So if we took x equals 7 and plugged it into this quadratic, the first factor would be 0, which means it doesn't matter what the second factor is because the entire thing would be 0. Or we can take our second factor, subtract 2 from both sides, and gives us x equals negative 2 for our other 0, which means we can plug negative 2 in for x. The right factor is 0, which means it doesn't matter what the left factor is, the entire thing is 0. So our two answers would be x equals 7 and x equals negative 2. Let's check that. So our original equation was y equals x squared minus 5x minus 14. So if we plug 7 in, so 7 squared minus 5 times 7 minus 14 gives us 49 minus 35 minus 14. 49 minus 35 is 14. 14 minus 14 is 0. So there's 1 0. Let's try it again. We're going to plug in negative 2. So negative 2 squared minus 5 times negative 2 minus 14. Negative 2 squared is 4. Negative 5 times negative 2 is a positive 10. 4 and 10 gives us 14. Once again, 14 minus 14 gives us 0. So we can see that those two x values, when plugged back into the equation, give us zeros. So that is how we solve an equation by factoring. This process also works in reverse. So if we're given the zeros, we can then write the equation of the quadratic. So we have zeros at x equals negative 3 and x equals 8. So let's take a second and look back at what we just did, and let's reverse engineer this. So you'll see that our first 0 was x equals 7. The corresponding factor is x minus 7. So you'll notice that the factors are simply going to be the opposite sign of our zeros. And that's because in the process of solving it, we're going to do the opposite operation to solve for x. So if we fast forward, we go back here to this problem. If one of my zeros is x equals -3, I can add 3 to both sides, and I get x plus 3 equals 0. So one of my two factors is x plus 3. My other, I have x equals to 8, so I'm going to subtract 8 from both sides, giving me x minus 8 equals 0. There's my other factor. So this quadratic has two factors, x plus 3 and x minus 8. So what we want to be able to do is take that and then write it in standard form. So all we're going to do is multiply these two factors together. X plus 3, x minus 8, x squared, negative 8x, 3x, and negative 24. So that gives us x squared. We're going to combine our like terms down the center. Negative 8x and 3x gives us negative 5x. And then we have negative 24. You wanted to check your work. You could take that equation, plug in x equals -3, and you should get 0. And then try it again, plug in x equals 8, and once again, you should get 0. One of the key things we want to notice here is how the zeros and the factors match up. It's a very important relationship. All right, now it's your turn. I've given you a quadratic equation, y equals x squared plus 9x plus 18. I want you to find the zeros. I want you to do so by factoring. So look at the first example we did. You're going to factor this equation, and then you're going to use the zero product property to find your zeros. Pause the video now. If you did it correctly, you should have gotten x values of -3 and -6 as your zeros. If you want to check your work, take those values one at a time and plug them into your quadratic and make sure they give you a y value of 0. As always, if you have any questions or concerns that came up as you've watched the video, make sure you write any questions down. I'll be more than happy to answer them next time I see you in class.